The year was 1882, and the land surrounding Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, carried a weight that could be felt in the dry winds blowing over the dusty plains. It was a time of transition, where traditions of native tribes stood face to face with the steady advance of American expansion. The railroad tracks had begun carving their way into the region, bringing merchants, settlers, and soldiers who would forever alter the cultural fabric of the Southwest. Yet, despite the sense of progress whispered in the streets of Santa Fe, there were still places hidden away from curious eyes, pockets of isolation where secrets thrived, shielded by silence and custom. On the edge of this shifting landscape, whispers began to stir. Travelers stopping at roadside inns recounted uneasy stories of a Comanche chief whose family practices did not align with the moral codes of the wider society. Some dismissed these rumors as prejudice, exaggerations meant to discredit native leaders who resisted assimilation. But others, including churchmen, school teachers, and a few government agents, began to take note. The tales were consistent enough to suggest that beneath the veil of hearsay lay something profoundly disturbing. It was against this backdrop that a territorial officer, charged with investigating the welfare of native children in the surrounding villages, was directed toward a particular homestead. What brought him there was not an official complaint filed through the courts, but rather the urgent words of a missionary nurse who had been traveling through the region. She spoke of a young girl, frail, withdrawn, her eyes carrying the weight of someone robbed of her youth, who was introduced by the tribe not as a child, but as a wife. The very idea struck at the heart of decency, sparking both disbelief and alarm. When the officer arrived in Santa Fe that spring, he was greeted by townsfolk with knowing glances. They had heard similar rumors but had grown accustomed to treating them with silence, for fear of igniting conflict with the tribes or inviting violence upon themselves. Still, the whispers would not die down. "There is something unnatural in that household," one shopkeeper confided quietly, careful not to let the words carry. "The girl is too young. She should be in school, not carrying the burdens of a woman." The investigation, however, would not be straightforward. Customs among native groups were often misunderstood or misrepresented by outsiders, and accusations of impropriety were sometimes used as weapons of control. Yet, in this case, there lingered a persistent feeling that what was happening extended beyond cultural misunderstanding into the realm of exploitation. As the officer prepared to ride out toward the encampment, the spring air carried both dust and tension. His journey would not only reveal the conditions of one family but also expose a haunting truth about the dangers of unchecked power and isolation. This was not just a story about one man's authority over his kin. It was the story of a child who had been denied the very essence of childhood, forced into a role that should never have been hers, and what waited to be uncovered would shake the fragile balance between tradition, law, and humanity itself. The officer's horse trotted steadily along the rugged trail that cut across the outskirts of Santa Fe, carrying him toward the Comanche settlement where the rumors had taken root. The spring sun was unrelenting, casting long shadows across the barren earth and illuminating the adobe homes scattered along the way. Life here bore little resemblance to the bustling town center. The land was harsher, the soil dry, and water scarce. Every dwelling seemed to stand as a testimony to endurance, built not for comfort but for survival. When he reached the settlement, the first thing that struck him was the silence. Unlike the chatter of children he might have expected, there was only the faint rustle of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant sound of livestock. The houses, mostly small mud structures patched with wooden beams, appeared weathered and tired. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at the dry earth, while a few goats lingered near a broken fence. The scene revealed a community that existed at the very margins of society, removed, self-contained, and suspicious of outsiders. A woman emerged first, her expression wary, her clothes simple but neat. She looked to be in her 30s, her hands calloused from labor. She did not speak at once, only studied the officer with eyes that conveyed both pride and distrust. Behind her, 2 children peeked out from the doorway of a low hut. Their faces were thin, their clothes patched. The officer raised his hat politely and introduced himself, explaining that he was there to understand the conditions of the community. to ensure that children were receiving care and education as required by territorial law. His words, though formal and carefully chosen, seemed to stir unease. From the far side of the settlement, several men emerged, among them the chief himself. An imposing figure with broad shoulders, weathered skin, and eyes that seemed carved from stone. He carried himself with authority, his presence commanding silence from those around him. Though age had touched his hair with gray, his bearing was one of dominance and unyielding pride. The officer's gaze wandered past the chief, landing on a small figure standing near one of the huts. It was the girl, the one spoken of in whispers. She could not have been more than 12, her frame fragile, her movements hesitant. She clutched a woven shawl tightly around her shoulders, as if to shield herself from both the wind and the stares. But what unsettled the officer most was not her youth. It was the way she was presented. She did not stand among children, but beside the chief, as though positioned deliberately at his side. The chief spoke in a low, measured tone, addressing the officer in broken English, enough to make his meaning clear. Strangers were not welcome to pry into matters of family. Still, the officer pressed forward, noting the living conditions, the lack of proper bedding, the scarcity of food stores, the air of exhaustion that clung to the women. Though he had come under the guise of routine welfare inspection, it was evident from the guarded faces and tense atmosphere that something far deeper was hidden here. The settlement seemed to breathe secrecy. Every glance, every pause in conversation hinted that beneath the surface of daily survival, there lay a truth that no one dared speak aloud. The officer lingered in the settlement longer than most visitors would have dared. He walked slowly, taking in details that might have escaped a casual glance. What he noticed first were the faces that carried both strength and weariness, etched by years of hardship. But among them, one stood out, the girl. Her presence unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. She avoided direct eye contact, her gaze fixed on the ground whenever someone addressed her. Unlike the other children, she did not run about or play. Instead, she hovered close to the chief, her posture rigid, as if tethered by an invisible chain of expectation. Her shawl slipped slightly at one point, revealing wrists far too thin for someone who should have been in the bloom of carefree youth. The officer noticed the small gestures, a hand placed firmly on her shoulder by the chief, a subtle flinch when his tone grew stern, and the absence of warmth that should have defined such interactions. The girl seemed less a child and more a possession, bound by a role she neither chose nor understood. Other signs deepened his unease. The dwelling assigned to her stood apart from those of the women and younger children. It was sparse inside, no toys, no school materials, no objects of comfort. Instead, there was a mat, a woven blanket, and a small chest that seemed far too plain for someone of her age. When he stepped inside briefly, the air felt heavy, stagnant, as if the very walls absorbed the silence of her stolen childhood. During mealtime, another unsettling detail emerged. While children usually ate together, laughing or sharing scraps, the girl was seated beside the chief, presented not as a daughter or niece, but as if she belonged in the place of a spouse. Conversations hushed when the officer's eyes lingered too long on this arrangement. The men cast wary glances, and the women lowered their heads, refusing to meet his gaze. The officer began to sense an unspoken rule at play. No one dared question the chief's decisions. His authority, rooted in both tradition and fear, seemed absolute. Yet there was a subtle tension in the air, a quiet dissent visible in the eyes of a few women who, while silent, carried expressions of sorrow. It was as though they longed to speak but knew that words would bring nothing but retribution. As evening fell, the officer wrote brief notes by the dim light of a lantern. He recorded the girl's age as not more than 12, her demeanor as withdrawn and fearful, and her relationship to the chief as unclear but deeply troubling. He hesitated before writing the last line. Her role in this household is not that of a child. Though he had no proof yet, every observation pressed upon him the same conclusion. Something was profoundly wrong here. The whispers he had heard in Santa Fe were no longer rumors. They were warnings, and the reality was even darker than he had imagined. To understand what the officer was witnessing, one had to consider the long and complicated history that had shaped the land and its people. By 1882, the Comanche were no longer the formidable power that had once ruled the southern plains with unmatched skill and ferocity. Decades of war with U.S. forces, epidemics brought by settlers, and the relentless advance of the railroad had fractured their strength. Many bands had been forced into reservations or scattered across remote territories where survival meant clinging to what traditions they could preserve. In Santa Fe and its surrounding settlements, the clash between cultures was ever present. Government agents preached assimilation, churches demanded conversion, and schools pushed to strip away native languages. Yet, for families like the chiefs, isolation had become a shield, an attempt to maintain control over their way of life in a world that sought to erase it. But isolation came at a cost. With dwindling resources and limited contact with the outside, customs twisted under the weight of survival. Practices once intended to strengthen kinship bonds could harden into something darker, crossing moral lines recognized even in the harsh frontier. Local townsfolk remembered stories that had circulated for years about the chief's household. Some said he had lost his first wife to disease in the late 1870s and never remarried. Others claimed he had taken in his sister's daughter as a ward after her parents' deaths, raising her under his roof. But whispers suggested that the line between guardian and husband had blurred, and that what was once protection had turned into possession. The settlement itself bore marks of decline. Livestock were few, crops sparse, and trade with Santa Fe merchants had nearly ceased. Many families had moved closer to towns to sell crafts or seek labor, but the chief's group remained withdrawn, rarely venturing beyond their small domain. It was said that he believed outsiders brought corruption, that only by keeping his kin close could they preserve their identity. To some, this was admirable resilience. To others, it was a dangerous rigidity that bred secrecy. Missionary accounts provided further layers of context. A nurse who had visited 2 years earlier wrote of a girl too young, dressed as a wife, though her words had been dismissed by superiors as a misunderstanding of cultural norms. Another document from a church school noted the absence of certain children whose names had once appeared on enrollment lists, quietly struck off without explanation. All of these fragments painted a picture of a family and a leader trapped between two worlds. On one side was the demand to assimilate into American law and morality. On the other, the desperate attempt to resist total erasure of their traditions. Somewhere in that tension, the boundaries of right and wrong had become obscured. For the officer, learning this history did not excuse what he saw unfolding before him. If anything, it made the situation more alarming. It showed how long the silence had endured, how many opportunities there had been for someone to intervene, and how a girl's childhood had been surrendered to a distorted sense of duty and control. As the officer continued his stay near the settlement, he began to piece together fragments that hinted at a darker truth. What had at first seemed like troubling impressions now began to align into a pattern. Each small detail, the girl's withdrawn demeanor, the separation of her living space, the way the chief positioned her at his side, added weight to his suspicions. One evening, he was invited, reluctantly, to share a meal inside the chief's dwelling. The structure was dimly lit, with a single fire casting shadows across the mud walls. Animal hides hung in the corners, and a few personal items, a hunting bow, worn blankets, clay vessels, spoke of both pride and scarcity. Yet what struck the officer most was the girl's presence. She served food not as a child helping her elders, but with the measured silence of a wife fulfilling obligation. When she sat, it was beside the chief, not among the women or children. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed a bowl, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met the officer's. In them he saw something that unsettled him more than all the rumors. A plea unspoken, a flicker of fear quickly hidden beneath lowered lashes. Later, he questioned other members of the settlement, but answers were evasive. When he asked about the girl's parents, one man muttered that they had died years before, leaving her in the chief's care. A woman, when pressed, whispered only, "She is his now," before turning away, refusing to say more. The phrase echoed in his mind, heavy with implication. Searching for clearer evidence, the officer turned to the sparse records he had brought with him. Church registries from Santa Fe showed the girl's name listed as a child to be enrolled at a mission school 5 years earlier. Yet there was no follow-up, no attendance noted. It was as if she had vanished from official memory the moment she was taken into the chief's household. He began sketching connections in his notebook. Physical similarities between the girl and the chief, subtle but present, raising questions about blood ties. Documents showing her absence from expected public records. Testimonies, though hushed, that implied acceptance of her unnatural role. The picture forming was one of a community bound by silence, unwilling or unable to challenge the authority of their leader. The more the officer asked, the colder the stares became. At night, he sensed eyes watching him from the shadows, a quiet warning that his presence was no longer welcome. Still, he could not turn away. His duty was not only to enforce the law but to protect those without a voice. And in this settlement, the girl's silence screamed louder than any confession could. By the time he closed his notebook on that 5th night, his suspicions had hardened into conviction. He no longer wondered if the rumors were true. He now feared only how deep the truth would cut when it was finally revealed. The more the officer pressed for answers, the clearer it became that resistance would define the path ahead. What had begun as wary glances and reluctant silences soon hardened into outright hostility. The chief's authority was absolute within the settlement, and every question the officer posed was met with half-truths or stony refusals. On the 6th day of his stay, he attempted a direct conversation with the chief. Seated outside the largest hut, the officer unfolded his notes and carefully explained the requirements of territorial law, that all children of school age must be registered and given proper education, that marriages involving minors were not legally recognized, and that guardianship could not extend into conjugal authority. He spoke firmly but respectfully, hoping to bridge the cultural divide with reason. The chief listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than the officer's face. When the officer finished, the chief spoke in broken English, his words sharp and final. "Our ways are not your ways. She is mine. No more words." With that, he rose, turned his back, and walked away. From that moment, the atmosphere thickened with tension. Women who had once offered faint smiles now looked down when he passed. Men who had nodded in greeting began standing in groups, their voices low, their eyes following his every movement. At night, the sound of drums echoed faintly from across the hills, a reminder, perhaps, that he was an outsider in a place where authority flowed not from laws on paper, but from tradition and fear. Attempts to involve local townspeople yielded little support. In Santa Fe, merchants and settlers expressed concern but urged caution. "The Comanche are proud," one said. "Push too hard, and you'll only invite bloodshed." Even the missionary nurse who had first raised the alarm warned him that the law moved slowly, and that without undeniable proof, officials would look the other way rather than risk confrontation. The officer also faced legal obstacles. The territory's courts had only limited jurisdiction over native groups, and intervention often sparked debates over sovereignty versus protection. Some argued that to interfere in tribal matters was to impose foreign law on a sovereign people. Others whispered that the government was too preoccupied with railroad expansion to care about the suffering of one child hidden away in a distant settlement. Each attempt to move closer to the truth was met with invisible walls. The girl was kept at the chief's side, never alone, shielded from questions. Neighbors who might have spoken clamped their mouths shut. Even those who seemed sympathetic, like the woman who had whispered, "She is his now," retreated into silence when pressed again. By the end of that week, the officer found himself isolated. He carried his notebook and his doubts, but little else. It was as though the settlement itself conspired to keep its secrets locked away, daring him to step beyond the fragile boundary between observer and intruder. And yet, with every unanswered question, his determination deepened. For behind every wall of resistance, he sensed the presence of a truth too terrible to remain hidden forever. It was on the edge of defeat, when silence seemed unbreakable, that the first cracks in secrecy began to show. The officer, weary of evasions, turned his attention to those on the periphery. the elderly, the wanderers, and the few who drifted between the settlement and nearby towns. These were people less bound by the chief's authority, their voices softened by age or hardship, yet sometimes willing to speak when others would not. One evening, while visiting a trading post miles from the settlement, he encountered an old man who once lived among the Comanche but now spent his days selling leather goods to settlers. When asked about the chief, the man lowered his voice and said, "He took her too soon. Everyone knows. Some stay quiet because they fear him, others because they no longer know what is right or wrong." The man refused to elaborate further, but the words were enough to confirm that unease was not his alone. Back in Santa Fe, the officer searched through records again. In a box of mission reports, he uncovered a letter from a teacher dated 4 years earlier. The note mentioned a girl, by name, who had been expected to attend the mission school but never arrived, despite repeated assurances from her guardian. The handwriting carried frustration, even alarm, but no follow-up had been recorded. The girl's absence had simply been allowed to fade from official notice. The most compelling revelation came from the missionary nurse who had first raised the alarm. Meeting her in confidence, away from watchful eyes, the officer pressed for details. She recalled her visit vividly. "I was brought into his house under the pretense of tending to an illness. She was there, the girl, dressed not as a child but in the garments of a woman. I asked her age. She whispered 12. When I questioned the chief, he said she was his wife, his choice, his right. I reported it, but no one wanted conflict with the tribe." Her voice trembled as she confessed, "I still see her eyes at night. They were not the eyes of a wife. They were the eyes of a child." Pieces began to align like stones in a wall. Each testimony, each document, added weight to the officer's suspicions. His notebook now contained not only his personal observations but external confirmations. The missing school record, the nurse's first-hand account, the trader's whispered admission. Even within the settlement itself, subtle signs of resistance surfaced. A young woman, no older than 20, passed by him one morning as he observed the huts. Without stopping, she let slip a quiet phrase in halting English. "She does not belong to him." Before he could respond, she walked away, her head lowered, but the message lingered. Though incomplete, the evidence was growing harder to dismiss. The officer knew it still lacked the undeniable force of proof that courts or territorial authorities demanded. But he also knew that the silence surrounding the girl was beginning to fracture. And with each fracture came the promise that the truth, long buried in secrecy, was preparing to break free. The breaking point arrived not through confrontation, but through an accident of timing. One late afternoon, the officer returned to the settlement unexpectedly after following a trail near the river. As he approached the chief's dwelling, he overheard raised voices inside. The chief's deep tone was unmistakable, stern and commanding, but mingled with it was the softer, trembling voice of the girl. For the first time, he heard her resist, whispering words of refusal that barely carried beyond the doorway. The officer froze, his heart quickening. He knew he could not barge in without provoking open conflict. Yet the fragments he caught, pleas of, "I am too young," and the chief's harsh insistence, were enough to shatter any remaining doubt. This was no cultural misunderstanding, no misinterpretation of tradition. It was exploitation, clear and undeniable. Later that evening, fortune brought him the testimony he needed. The young woman who had once whispered, "She does not belong to him," approached him in secret. Fearful but resolute, she revealed what others had dared not say. "She is his sister's child," the woman confessed. "He calls her wife. We all know, but no one stops him. We are afraid." Her eyes welled with tears as she continued. "She never played, never learned, never lived as a child. From the moment her parents died, she was his possession." The words struck the officer with the force of a hammer. The truth was now spoken plainly, undeniable in its cruelty. The chief had taken his niece, barely a girl, and claimed her as a bride. To secure written confirmation, the officer persuaded the woman to allow him to record her statement. By lantern light, in hurried handwriting, he transcribed her words as she repeated them. her voice shaking with each sentence. When she signed her name at the bottom, she whispered, "If he finds out, I am finished." Her courage, born of desperation, sealed the first piece of irrefutable evidence. The final blow came days later when the missionary nurse returned with a small ledger she had once kept during her visits. In it, she had written the girl's age at the time, 11. Next to it, in hurried scrawl, she had noted, "Introduced to me as wife of the chief." That single entry, dated and signed, became the tangible proof the officer had been waiting for. When he gathered these testimonies, his notebook heavy with confession and record, he knew the moment had come. The great revelation was not the rumors whispered in town, nor the uneasy glances of villagers. It was the undeniable truth that a child's life had been stolen, her innocence replaced with the burden of a role she could never consent to. The officer closed his book that night with trembling hands. The case was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was a matter of justice. And with the truth now exposed, there would be no turning back. When the officer finally presented his findings to the territorial authorities in Santa Fe, the atmosphere in the small courtroom was tense. The case was delicate, balancing on the edge of law, culture, and politics. Few wanted to ignite conflict with the Comanche, yet the evidence, written testimonies, records from the missionary nurse, and the officer's own detailed notes, was impossible to ignore. At first, there was hesitation. Some officials argued that tribal matters lay beyond the reach of territorial courts. Others worried about stirring unrest among neighboring communities. But the officer, resolute, laid out the case with clarity. A child had been denied her childhood, forced into a role that was both unlawful and immoral. His words were measured but sharp, cutting through the silence. The trial that followed was unlike any other. The chief, proud and unbending, stood before the court with an expression that betrayed neither shame nor fear. He insisted that what he had done was his right, an extension of tradition and authority. But his defense faltered in the face of written proof. The ledger entry from the nurse, the testimony of the young woman, and the officer's observations formed a chain too strong to dismiss. The courtroom filled with townsfolk, missionaries, and a few members of the settlement who dared to attend. Murmurs swept through the crowd when the girl herself was brought in. Dressed in plain clothes, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not need to speak. Her youth, her fragility, and the weariness in her expression spoke louder than any words. In the end, the judgment was harsh by the standards of the time. The chief was stripped of his authority within the settlement and sentenced to confinement under territorial custody. Though some argued for leniency, the court declared that the protection of children outweighed claims of tradition. For the first time, the silence that had shielded him was broken. Yet the consequences rippled far beyond the courtroom. Within the settlement, families divided, some condemning the chief's actions, others resenting the intrusion of outside law. Trust between the community and the authorities fractured further, deepening the wounds of an already fragile relationship. For the girl, the judgment brought both relief and uncertainty. She was placed under the care of a mission school, where she would be sheltered, fed, and educated. But her innocence could not be restored, nor the years she had lost returned. Teachers described her as quiet, distant, carrying a weight far beyond her age. The case became a matter of public debate across Santa Fe. Newspapers carried the story with headlines that provoked outrage and sorrow. Some saw it as proof of the need for stricter oversight of isolated communities. Others decried it as an example of cultural suppression. In the officer's eyes, however, there was no ambiguity. A wrong had been committed, and at last, it had been acknowledged. Yet the judgment carried with it a haunting truth. Justice, though served, had come too late to save a childhood already stolen. In the months that followed the trial, the story of the chief and his niece settled into the memory of Santa Fe like dust carried on the wind. Never fully gone, always lingering. The case had exposed not just the suffering of one child, but the fragile intersection between culture, law, and human dignity. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about silence, complicity, and the responsibilities owed to those without power or voice. For the girl, now removed from the settlement, The path ahead was uncertain. At the mission school, teachers noted her progress in reading and writing, but also her guarded nature. She rarely joined the laughter of other children, preferring solitude, her expression distant, as though the past still gripped her tightly. Some whispered that she would never truly escape the shadow of what had been done to her, that even in freedom, she carried scars too deep to heal. Yet there were small signs of resilience: her steady improvement in studies, her quiet kindness toward younger children, and the way she clung to the routine of school life as though it offered her a sense of order she had never known before. For the settlement, the consequences were heavy. Without the chief's authority, the community fractured. Some families moved closer to Santa Fe, seeking trade and protection, while others drifted deeper into isolation, convinced that the intrusion of outsiders had destroyed their autonomy. The once unquestioned authority of the chief became a cautionary tale, a reminder that silence in the face of wrongdoing only deepened wounds. The territorial government, spurred by public outrage, began introducing stricter policies to monitor the welfare of children in remote communities. Inspectors were assigned to ensure that records were kept, and that education laws were enforced more consistently. While these measures were imperfect and often resisted, they marked the first steps toward preventing such tragedies from repeating themselves. As for the officer, he carried the case with him long after he left Santa Fe. His reports were filed, his duty fulfilled, but the memory of the girl's eyes, the silent plea he had seen that first evening, remained with him. In quiet moments, he wondered whether justice had truly been done. The chief had been punished, yes, but punishment could not restore the years already stolen. What lingered instead was a lesson about the cost of neglect, the danger of isolation, and the courage it took for even a single voice, the nurse, the young woman, the girl herself, to break through silence. History would not record her name in textbooks, nor would monuments be raised in her memory. Yet, in the quiet halls of the mission school and in the whispered debates across Santa Fe, her story endured. It served as a reminder that childhood is not a privilege to be given or withheld at will. It is a right, fragile and precious, demanding vigilance and protection. And so, the tale closed not with triumph, but with reflection. A girl had been denied her childhood, but in the exposing of her suffering, others began to see the dangers of secrets left unchecked. It was a lesson carved into the landscape of 1882 Santa Fe, that silence, left unbroken, can be as destructive as the act it conceals.